in Kingston. My name is Adam Ryan. I'm one of the curators here at CPW, and tonight I'll be introducing our speakers. But first, I have a couple housekeeping items to get through. So starting on September 11th, we have a project salon with local photographer Charles Purvis. The group will meet at our digital lab, which will soon be in this space. They will meet twice a month on Wednesday evenings to hone in on an individual's artistic practice and output. The group will aim to provide a space for reflection and support of others who share our passion and commitment. Next, starting on September 14th, we have a monthly critique group that's being led by Leslie Deschler-Canosi. And that group will also meet at our digital lab, which is moving here next week. And that group will meet once a month on Saturdays. And participants will practice critical observation together while also deepening their dialogue within their own work and that of other artists. This intentional space is open to those who are actively engaged in an artistic practice and or working towards a project such as a portfolio, a book, or an exhibition. And lastly, we have the photo book, A Personal Practice, which will be a 10-week class taught by Adriana Alt. And this class is structured with readings, field trips, assignments. The participants will meet weekly to explore the visual and conceptual relationships between their personal photography and a broad range of human life experiences. It will include close examinations of contemporary photography and artworks, critical readings, and intensive critiques. Tonight, however, we have two fantastic artists ready to share their work. We have Andina Marie Osorio. Andina is an Afro-Caribbean artist born in the Bronx and is currently based between Brooklyn, New York, and New Haven, Connecticut. Osorio's practice utilizes photography and image-based installations to examine the genealogical analogies of domestic space and lineage in relation to her Puerto Rican heritage and her queer identity. Her practice employs self-portraiture, archival family photographs, installation, assemblage, appropriation, and soft sculptures. Osorio's practice exposes juxtapositions in the liminal space between generations, genders, and sexualities. Her interior photographs of domestic spaces transform into pictorial collages that question how to make a portrait without a physical body. In her installations, the ephemera and materials used to incite incidental memories and activate ancestral energies that reference the feminine domestic setting. Osorio explores her understanding of the queer image through her personal recollections of voyeurism and recreating performances or gestures that she yearns to memorialize. Andina is a recipient of the City Artist Corps Grant of New York City and the DRABL Artist Grant. Osorio was one of 50 artists to participate in the Four Freedoms Awakening Billboard campaign in 2020. Her work has been shown at the LES Gallery, at the Clemente and Weber Gallery in LA. She has been featured in Musée Magazine, Port Magazine, and Elephant Magazine. In 2024, Osorio was awarded residencies at the Center for Photography in Woodstock, Fire Island Artist Residency, and the Sharp Willentus Studio Program. Osorio is a recent graduate of Yale's MFA program. And secondly, and who will be coming up first tonight, Avion Pearce's work. Avion Pearce's work explores the use of photography as a conveyor of many truths, both in a historical context and in this present moment. They often use created environments, costumes, props, and found objects to stage narrative scenes that attempt to fill in blanks left in Western pictorial histories. The characters of these narratives are immersed in the routines of the day-to-day, engaged in moments of tenderness, bliss, fury, melancholy, and quiet introspection. Avion Pearce studied photography at Parsons New School for Design and has an MFA from the Yale School of Art. They received a BFA photography scholarship from Parsons, and they are a NISCA NYFA Artist Fellowship recipient. Their work has been shown at Ryan Lee Gallery, Aperture, and Hudson Opera House, and has been commissioned by New York Magazine, W, Crack, Netflix, and the New York Times. And they are the 2024 Aperture Portfolio Prize winner. So please join me in welcoming Avion Pearce.
Hello, thank you for being here. I wrote a statement, which I don't usually do, because I wanted to sort of tie a bunch of different projects together and to sort of follow the line of thought and inquiry that is really important to me in my work. So I think of photography as a sort of magic. Light as energy spreads across the surface of film, the world appears suddenly as I wish for it to appear in my hands. I think of conjuring as a part of my West Indian heritage and my right as a self-appointed author of histories with my camera, as a world builder and a dream manifester. I'm interested in the intangible, that which we cannot explain but deeply feel, of existing in this world, in this body, and how photography functions in relationship to my quest for understanding and meaning. At the root of my practice, there are the politics of the medium, how to photograph community with care and intention, as well as how to represent myself, my dreams, my longings, desires, the complexity of a collective whole. I have many questions, and photography continues to provide me with answers, but also presents generous challenges. Can intensity of color, shadow, and light be communicators of feeling? Can softness and focus describe memory? What does denial of exact description provide? What can a surface communicate? Cumulatively, can the combination of these qualities speak to something metaphysical and just outside of our reach? So that's me. I was born in Flatbush in 1990. This is me in that apartment, maybe in 1992. I am of Guyanese descent. My parents were born in Guyana. I'm a first generation American. And I grew up reading and creating worlds and writing. Writing was my first love, telling stories. And it's really the root of everything that I do, and really important to me in my practice. I went on to, well, I'll go back. I went on to study writing and then eventually to study photography. And while I was in school at Parsons, I started to kind of try to pull together, through looking at a lot of other work, what I wanted to say with my work, what contribution I could make to the world with my work. And one of the first series that I saw that really inspired me and excited me was Evidence by Larry Sultan and Mike Mandel. It's essentially a collection of images that they've collected from many different government offices. There are photographs of field studies, of different experiments, and it's not really clear what the photos were used for necessarily. And so through the combination of a sort of sequence of the images, they were able to tell a story about our world and this present moment and the moment those photographs were made. And so it was really important to me. I started to think about the power of photography, that photographs could create an idea of our world, to give us a sense of our place in that world, and that I could use this tool to tell stories that were important to me and histories that are important to me. And the second project that I found in that time was Fauna by John Fontcuberta. And it's essentially a fake history. He looked at a bunch of photos, of anthropological photos, and created taxidermy and staged these images and created drawings and created this whole entire world of animals that never existed in this sort of fantasy, and presented it as if it was fact. And so I was really thinking about my own family. So my family doesn't have many photographs from Guyana. So I think a lot of my like yearning for my own history comes from that. And so I was thinking about photography in relationship to queer histories that are missing. And also, I think the sort of really tender and sentimental way that like certain important histories are treated in historical institutions. So I started looking at museums, at their collections, at the way that they preserve and present objects of important historical figures. And I thought that this could be a way for me to sort of like work through looking at a queer history and presenting objects from that history. And in addition to looking at these collections, I was also watching a lot of period films. I'm a big period film nerd. And I was just interested in sort of like the way that you could create a world around a history to sort of like create a mood and yeah, bring a viewer back in time through mood and affect. And yeah. So I wanted to share this quote because while I was sort of gathering all of these pieces that were a part of the project that I'm going to share, I reread Beloved, which I read when I was younger. And there's a moment in the beginning of Beloved where one of the characters goes into the house of a dead girl who haunts her family, essentially. And she comes to them as a red light or as wind or sound or knocking furniture around. And I was really struck by this passage because in this moment, she comes into the house as this like bright, intense red light, and they're trying to understand if this color is a sign of something that they should be afraid of or of something that they should embrace or walk into. And so I thought a lot about, there's a phrase or a word for this sort of like space between mood and atmosphere. It's a Stimmung. It's a German word. And I was looking into the meaning of it, and I found a description that it's the feeling in myself and the feeling between us. It's something between mood and atmosphere, something that is collectively felt. Stimmung is the emotional medium that realizes the situation as a whole. And so I was looking at a lot of film as I was kind of like mood boarding. I looked at Wong Kar-wai's In the Mood for Love, the sort of warm golden hues. Fassbinder's films also use these very intense colors to create this feeling, this emotion. I looked at Dario Argento's Suspiria, which is actually a horror film, and Belly by Hype Williams. And with all of these things in mind, I started to write about the women. And I'm just gonna read what I wrote as I pass through the images. There's a makeshift cottage sitting on the bank of the Mississippi River, perched just above the edge of opaque, swampy water. Its blue-gray walls are covered almost entirely by vines. The air is so thick one can feel its reluctant parting with each movement of the body. Even the flies in Louisiana can feel the burden of their weight against flight. Watching the light change through small square windows, the figures of two women of varying shades of brown rise in the frame of their bed. Each day starts with a slow roll onto feet and into the southern humidity. Bathing, eating, and loving all occur against the backdrop of a desolate swampland. And yeah, my partner and I at the time staged these photos. And I started to create an actual archive for them. So I was collecting objects and also writing letters and staining them. This one is dated 7/18/1939, and it says, "My sweet love, yesterday I waited all day in the hallway by the front door for your letter. It didn't come, and so I decided to fill in the time with another unanswered letter. Please forgive me. I didn't mean what I said. I was scared, and fear makes me lose myself. Do you remember the hours we spent by the river last week? I can still feel your fingertips through the grass. Write to me, yours, Kitty." And I really just got lost in making this world. I mean, I took objects around me, I put them in photographs in a similar style that museums use to document, I mean, especially the Met. Will present objects in this way in a more sort of like clinical style with a bright light. And I wanted to feel like they were charged with something of like a feeling, an emotion, a sort of like warm tenderness. And I mean, one of the objects, you can't really see it, it's not dark enough, but my girlfriend cut off her hair. And so in the middle of the project, and so I used that as one of their objects. This is another object, another camera. And this is just an example of how the work was presented. I titled that photograph, "How High That Highest Candle Lights the Dark," which is actually a line from a Wallace Stevens poem called Final Soliloquy of the Interior Paramour. And he just talks about God and the imagination being one and the same. And it felt significant in relation to this project. So the pandemic hit in 2020, and I was out of school, and I was thinking about what I would do next and what felt really important in that moment. And I felt like I had a sort of habit of escaping into my work by like creating worlds and thinking about queer history in relation to this current moment, but through that lens. And so I wanted to look at the world at this current moment, to look at my community that was actually struggling because of the pandemic. A lot of my friends work in a sort of gig economy. They're freelancers and they lost work and they were worried about staying in the city. And I also had a serious health condition that kind of changed my ways of thinking about living and thinking about making. And I feel like all of these things at once have like influenced the work. And so again, I started looking at photographers that I felt communicated something that was important to the work. And so I looked at Roy DeCarava, who made a lot of work in New York City. I was really drawn to his use of light and shadow, the darkness, the blackness of the prints, and the feeling that you get from looking at the richness of these black and whites. And I looked at Ming Smith, her long exposures, the movement, the magical quality of the images. And I looked at Graciela Iturbide, whose work I love because it really reflects the magic of the real world in a way that was really inspirational to me. And so another important part of thinking about this work was a poem that was shared with me by Audre Lorde, which I'm going to read. And it's called A Litany for Survival. For those of us who live at the shoreline, standing upon the constant edges of decision, crucial and alone. For those of us who cannot indulge the passing dreams of choice, who love in doorways coming and going in the hours between dawn, looking inward and outward at once before and after, seeking a now that can breed futures like bread in our children's mouths, so that their dreams will not reflect the death of ours. For those of us who were imprinted with fear, like a faint line in the center of our foreheads, learning to be afraid with our mother's milk, for by this weapon, this illusion of some safety to be found, the heavy-footed hope to silence us. For all of us, this instant and this triumph, we were never meant to survive. And when the sun rises, we are afraid it might not remain. When the sun sets, we are afraid it might not rise in the morning. When our stomachs are full, we are afraid of indigestion. When our stomachs are empty, we are afraid we may never eat again. When we are loved, we are afraid love will vanish. When we are alone, we are afraid love will never return. And when we speak, we are afraid our words will not be heard nor welcomed. But when we are silent, we are still afraid. So it is better to speak, remembering we were never meant to survive. And so I took a line from that poem in the hours between dawn. The series that I made is a bunch of portraits and cityscapes. I was looking at my community. I was thinking a lot about the way the city was changing, the way that gentrification is impacting Brooklyn. And then also I was looking at a lot of the bills and attempts to pass bills on transgender youth's rights. And I felt like I had a lot of conversations with my partner and with friends who felt that they weren't being represented in a way that offered more than a sort of flat or flattening view of them. And so, yeah, I started first with my closest, most intimate relationships. And I picked this image first because I feel like it holds so much of what I want to say with the project. I wish you could see the edges of it, but this is a friend, Ellington, who I've been making work with for the past 2 years. And that's been really special. And behind him is a poster of Minton's Harlem, which was a jazz club that closed. And the photo's from the 40s. It has Duke Ellington and a bunch of other jazz legends with him. And Ellington is the name that my friend took on. And for me, it's sort of reflective of old New York and present New York. And this use of light and you can't really see it here, but the light is visible in the frame. Felt like a gesture of this sort of like warm caress of a light. And yeah, I feel there are a few images from this series that bring all of the ideas together into one. And I think that this is maybe my favorite. And yeah, I just started to photograph Brooklyn, friends, ex-partners. And I was really strategic with the tools that I used. I started shooting with an 8x10 camera. because I felt like I wanted to think about the history of seducing large groups of people to move to certain places. So when I think about like westward expansion, for example, and the ways that photography was used to encourage people on the East Coast to move out west, I just wanted to think as I was like photographing this city that's one of the most photographed cities ever, to think about the history of making images of place and of people. And I think also I'm just very, I mentioned I have a lot of questions about photography as a medium and about my responsibility as a photographer and my responsibility to my community. And so I feel like part of thinking through that is thinking about the tools that I'm using and being very intentional with them. And this image is a camera obscura, actually. So if you don't know, this is my old apartment in Crown Heights. This is my ex-partner who's sleeping on the bed or pretending to sleep. But I blacked out the windows of our bedroom with garbage bags, and I made a hole about the size of like a dime, and shut the doors and blocked out all the light. And what happens is the room becomes a camera itself. So then the city outside of the window is projected onto the walls of the room. So if you can make it out on the top of the frame, that's the skyline outside of our apartment building. And again, I think this is another example of an image that's kind of bringing New York and the subjects together into one place. And this one is actually a self-portrait. I kept doing the camera obscuras because it felt like magic and it was amazing to do. And it's just another angle of that same room. And this photograph is of Ellington. You can't really see him, but the film that's being projected is The Aggressives, which is a documentary that was made in the 90s, maybe early 2000s. And it follows a few trans masc and masc of center youths around the city and looks at their lives and how they're surviving in the city. And it again felt like a kind of like full circle related film to include in this series with the folks that I've been photographing. I'll just go through. Okay. So I think along with my questions about photography, I'm also thinking about space. And if I'm thinking about what is intangible, what we feel, but we can't explain or communicate, I feel like an extension of making the work is also the way that I present it. And trying to make a viewer feel perhaps as much as I can that they're experiencing what I am projecting into the images. And so this was an installation that I did that had two sections. In the main section, there are flowers on the table. That's one of the portraits that I made on the back wall of my friend Sloan. And so there are anemones on the table in vases, and then on the ground, there are bleeding hearts. And they're attached to synthesizers. And so the synthesizers are basically tracking, or they're able to like communicate the sound of water moving through the stems of the plants, of the way that the plants are reacting to sunlight, and ultimately the sound of them dying, because plants begin to die after you cut them. And in the left section, a friend of mine who grew up with two deaf parents is signing Nothing Compares to You by Sinead O'Connor, and it's silent. And all that you can hear is the sound of the flowers. I don't know if I can I play a video? Oh, you can't hear that. So, what I was thinking about with that is, yeah, how I could create an extension of this idea of the things we cannot touch or understand through images, and the things that we cannot communicate with language or with sound. And I was thinking about the plants also in relation to the body, all the things that we experience and feel that are silent. And yeah, I've continued to kind of work through ways to create space that mirrors the work that I'm making. So this is an installation of the work that I described. It's a bunch of images from the series In the Hours Between Dawn, as well as another recreation of that last installation with the bleeding hearts and the video. And I painted the walls yellow. I was trying to think of a way to make the space feel the way light feels in the images. I wanted someone to walk into the space and like not only feel the warmth of that light, but also the glow of light itself. I think that for me, it felt very photographic. It felt like a conversation about light, which is photography. It's just essential to photography. And I layered the images around the space to kind of create movement around the installation. And in June of 2024, I won the Portfolio Prize. And part of that prize was to create an installation of the work that I submitted. And again, I was thinking I really wanted to paint the gallery pink. They said no. I asked a lot. And then I had to find like a workaround. And so, I don't know, one day after fighting with them for a while, I figured out that I could use the same light that's in the work in the space. And it changed the color of the photos. It changed, I think, the way that you experience the images. But I think that it was this really beautiful, like warm embrace. I put a lot of care into the photos that I make. I hope that they feel tender. I hope that they reflect the folks inside of the images and the city that I love. I included 8x10 contact prints, some of the images. That's another one. And I think I was really excited because I felt like, oh, it was like an aha moment. It was like, oh, I can actually feel, it feels like an invitation into the work in a different way. And that was really wonderful to create. How am I doing on time? 5 more minutes? Okay. I have another project that's like unresolved, so I'm gonna end there. Yeah, I think it's been really wonderful to kind of work through these questions, through space, through images, to think through our responsibility as photographers, what it means to represent people and place. And thank you so much for listening.
Thank you all for coming. My name is Andina. I'm gonna talk for a little bit, and I hope that's okay. I have about 90 slides, but I won't be too long. I would love to start this lecture with talking about my Titi Esther. She was born Esther Carmen Ramos, sister to my maternal grandmother. She's pictured here, and I want to say sometime in the 1960s. I'm assuming in Puerto Rico. Here's another photograph of her holding her grandson Larito, but we call him Larry. I'm still trying to figure out whose house this is. And then this photograph that is very dear to me, and I think one of my favorite photographs that I have in the archive. I've been collecting my familial archive over the years. And because of that, I know that my grandmother took this photograph, and it captures Esther and her husband giving her a really big kiss out of her in front of her house in Mount Vernon. And I think a big part of my interest in domestic space comes from this house. We lost this house when I was in high school, and I always think about if I could go back now and make pictures of that home, what it would look like. Which brings me to my first body of work, A Collection of a Life. And I have to start with this picture right here. This image was taken in 2017 at my Titi Esther's house in Co-op City. And for those of you who don't know, Co-op City is a public housing complex in the East Bronx. The demographic is mostly older residents. On the day that this was taken, I initially had only gone there to photograph my Aunt Esther and her daughter, who is also my godmother. And my godmother had mentioned to me that they were downsizing the apartment because she was getting a little bit older and she was having mobility issues and there was just too many things. And she was like, next time you come over, it's not going to look like this. And so I ended up making this image. And this image holds a lot for me and also is the framework for a lot of the work I'm making now. It's titled All These White Angels Surrounding All These Black Babies. And at the time, I had no idea how important this work would be and how much of an anchor it would be. And I realized it essentially was her entire life in a single photograph. Photographs of her grandchildren, of her daughter's wedding, her in her 20s, her taste in music, action figures, and a long-standing tradition in my family, which is portraits of baby boys in sailor uniforms. I don't know why. And so fast forward to grad school. This was taken in 2017 when I was still an undergrad. And then a couple years later when I was in grad school, my great aunt, who was her sister, came to visit me in my second semester. And she saw this print hanging up in my studio and she got so excited and she gasped and she was like, I want to take this print and I want to bring it to Esther's hospice room. At that point, she had been in the hospital for a couple of months. And so it like hadn't dawned on me that they hadn't seen this picture and that her apartment hadn't looked like this until 2017. And so all these years in between, she had never seen it. She ended up passing on March 7th in 2023, a few months after she received this print. And I think about how this was probably the first and last thing that she saw every day until her transition, and thinking about photography as a remedy for some grief that she was feeling, and how an image could hold together generations and kind of act as one last gesture to commemorate her life. And so I began thinking more about this process of grief and the power of photography and how they can be used in tandem, and thinking about the significance of documenting a domestic space kind of before the onset of grief, kind of serving as like a social document for that. I became really curious about the ways in which women take up space together in domestic settings that they've created for themselves. My practice was moving towards a perception of time and the importance of documenting homes and workspaces of matriarchs, and really thinking about what it means to take a portrait without a physical body. So this was a picture taken in 2020. My very good friend Moss, we were living together, and her grandmother had passed, and she lived in this house in Queens for 40 years. And while she was at the house and she was going through her own kind of process of grief, she called me and she was like, I need you to photograph this house because there's just so many things and we have so much stuff. And it's just, she was an artist in her own right. And so that's what I did. It was nice because there was some overlap. Her grandmother was actually an intimate wear professor at FIT where I went for undergrad. And it just amazed me that every single scissor and pin and needle and string had its place and its own power and its own intention. I'm interested in how ephemera and material and things get their meaning and how that can turn and be lost overnight. And I began to think about the realm of possibilities for objects to imagine their own roles in these women's lives. So I basically reached out to all of my friends and I asked if I could photograph their grandmother's homes, their mother's homes, their aunt's homes, or any women in their life that they knew kind of had their own, they were in charge of their own workspace or homes. I began to create an anthropology of images, thinking about manifestation and ownership and legacy through pictures and decor, furniture, space, in relation to specifically women occupying these spaces. I think there's an intersection to women's rights to possessions and the compulsion to collect ephemera, the common thread of artistry and that need to have it displayed. And I like to think of these images not only as documentation of a life lived, but some kind of feminist artistic archive. This work has taught me that grief is an emotion that's constantly knocking on the door of memory. And I want these images to function as a site of living for someone to recall to, that in turn is a celebration of their lives. And so I'm going to plug, if you know anyone around here that has a house that looks like this, I would love to be connected with them. So, yeah. And so I'm gonna move on a little bit. I would like to start this work with talking about this quote from The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison. I feel like it's really the framework for how I understand this next body of work. What they do not know is that this plain brown girl will build her nest stick by stick, make it her own invaluable world, and stand guard over its every plant, weed, and doily, even against him. In silence will she return the lamp to where she put it in the first place, remove the dishes from the table as soon as the last bite is taken, wipe the doorknob after a greasy hand has touched it. A sideline look will be enough to tell him to smoke in the back porch. Children will sense instantly that they cannot come into her yard to retrieve a ball, but men do not know these things. So the title of this work is Men Do Not Know These Things. And so again, going back, this photograph and this work actually began in 2017, again, while I was still in undergrad. And I was fascinated with the idea of a honeycomb structure. I was fascinated with honey being used as a natural preservative. It was even used as an embalming agent in ancient civilizations. And something about the structure reminded me of home. And then I began juxtaposing these honeycombs against the familial archive that I had been building. I was taking on the role as photographer and archivist of my family, and I was collecting these images of family members, both present and gone. And I was thinking and trying to work towards something that could tell a bigger story about what family means. And so some fun facts about bees. Honeybees specifically are all female. They're one of the only all female animals. The male honeybees are referred to as drones, and they live in a separate hive. And their one kind of role is to impregnate the queen, and then after that, they kind of have to get out of the hive. And so they have nothing to do with the maintenance of the hive. They have nothing to do with the building of the hive. And I think what's really interesting is that honeybees are born cleaning. So when they're hatched, their first job is to clean up after their cells, which is important for some reason. And then I moved on to sculpture. And this was made using an emulsion photo lift from NFP 100 Polaroid. And so it's a technique that if you cut off all the edges of the Polaroid and submerge it in water, the emulsion literally lifts up. And it's very malleable and it's flexible, but it's also very transparent. So you can see the structures of the comb behind it. And then it was so it was the emulsion and then the honeycomb, and then it was resin pour on top of that. And something that's been really interesting with doing this is that the chemicals, the resin and the honey never fully mixed well together. And so they leak all the time. And so it's a bit more of a living sculpture. But I'm also thinking about my self-appointed role as archivist using material that's unarchivable and what that means. And then again, I'm still working on this and still thinking about this into grad school. I kind of became obsessed with thinking about how I could take one image and make it into multiple different forms and make it separate from its origin. Each form with a new set of brand new eyes and a new way of thinking. And so the image on the top left is the original image, and then it's again, I took a Polaroid of it and then made it into a sculpture. And then the top right is a honeybee encased in a small glass holder. And these are some words that I'm thinking about when I'm thinking about making this work, and I'm thinking about the parallels between my understanding of matriarchy and growing up in my home and matriarchy of honeybees. And so after years of pushing this way of thinking, I finally understood that honeybees could be used as a personal allegory for how I understand domestic space. And so this is a video of how I made the next part of this work. There's a technique in beekeeping. When you want to merge two separate hives together, you'll put a piece of newsprint over the box and then put the other hive on top of that. And that gives them a chance to like hear and smell each other before fully either coming together as a hive or rejecting each other. And so I used that process to make these. And so as you can see, I'm still using the same photograph. It's a photograph of my mother and my father holding my brother outside of our house in the Bronx. And a large part of this work relies not only on like the collaboration of the bees, but I'm also asking for their labor. I printed other family photographs in newsprint with some kind of like familial snapshot or a photograph of a matriarch or something happening in the domestic setting. The details that you see are the tiny hands of the bees ripping away at it. It's kind of like a foreign body, and a lot of their life and a lot of their work has to do with cleaning. And so part of this process is them kind of tearing at these images. And this is a photograph of my great grandmother, the woman I was named after. And I love this picture because she's so proud of herself for making this Thanksgiving dinner. This photograph of Esther comes up again. And as I was working with a beekeeper, his name is Tim, he's amazing. He told me about a third hive that had died over the winter. And it's something that happens quite often with domesticated bees. They just didn't have enough food. They didn't produce enough that summer. And so he offered me 2 boxes of a dead hive. And what I found was really fantastic. Death and grief are topics that come up in my work a lot. And I think it has something to do with the archive that I'm working with because it's so essentially charged. But on the detail shots of this, you can see the bees kind of frozen and suspended in their death, huddled together. And I like to think about what their final moments would have been like. That the hive knew it was the end and that they rattled together and they were buzzing together for warmth next to each other, hiding in their cells or reaching out. A last embrace before death, and what I like to think is women confronting their death together as a hive always. And so, which brings me to another part. I'm talking a lot about this archive, and I feel like I should show you guys what it is. And this is the archive that is attached to a bigger body of work I'm not going to talk about today, but it's entitled Bendición, Dios te bendiga, which is specifically in a Caribbean Spanish-speaking thing that you would say to an elder. So it translates to blessings, God be with you, and it's a sign of respect, and it's a call and response. And I thought that that was very fitting for this work. And so this is a photograph of my great grandfather Jose, who's in the middle, surrounded by all of his children. That's my grandmother over there. This is my aunt Esther, and then all of their siblings. Because of the archive, I know that this was taken in the house that he bought with his pension in New Jersey. I also think that it was one of the last images that they all have together as adults, as a family. And something about this really speaks to me. I like that none of them are looking at the camera, at this particular camera. They're looking at somebody else. And I don't know where that picture is, but this is the one that made it. And yeah, and then I began piecing together stories like this one. So this is a picture of my uncle in the middle, and my cousins next to him. And I know that this was taken in Queens because they still live in this house. But I also know that this was on the same day because he's wearing the same shirt, and it was his 8th grade picture day. And so being able to make those connections through this archive have been really formative. Both of my grandfathers on both sides died before I was born, and so the only way I know them is through pictures. And so this is Poppy with my mom and her dog Liza. And then I find really great pictures like this, and I just think this is objectively funny. This is a photograph of my mom. I think she was maybe 16 or 17 when she went on Hawaii for Christmas with my grandparents, and this was the photo. It's the Merry Christmas, really gets me. The set of twins in our family, Anjani and Molefi, known as Ibei, which is the Yoruba word for twins. My little tribe of women, the women that raised me, the women that are so important to my life and my practice. And this is them 40 years earlier. And I love that I have these images of them. My mom and my grandparents. My godmother with her amazing afro. My great-grandfather in his Navy uniform. My grandmother being very sassy in a photo booth picture. This photograph that is, I grew up with this photograph in basically every family member's house, and it's a photograph of my great-grandmother holding my uncle, Jason, and I'm still looking for this original image. My mom for picture day. And then baby me. And there's another archive that I work with, which is a personal archive, one that I've been building for quite a few years that I didn't realize was even being made. And this is also part of a larger project I will talk about. And it stands for I'm So Glad You're Here, which is what the other body of work is called. And I just wanted to make pictures of my life and my friends and how beautiful I thought they were, and thinking about my little queer world and my little queer life in New York and how it was ever expanding. And so I just wanted to photograph everything, like partners or friends at bars, friends that play with each other. I have a rule that whenever I'm photographing 2 people, they have to be saying yes to each other. Lots of beach pictures. Reese Beach in Rockaway, Brooklyn, is an incredibly important place to me and a lot of other queers of New York. Yeah, and then this is a picture of my IUD removal. She wouldn't let me take it home, so I had to take a picture instead. Yeah, and photo booth pictures. And I began thinking about these pictures and how I wanted to tether them together in time. And the here from the I'm So Glad You're Here carries the weight of other ways of knowing, I think, in a time that evokes other ways of being. To understand queerness, one must look inward and comprehend the yearning of the self. I aim for my photographs to serve as a reflection not only of my own desires, but also for viewers to see my subjects as I do, and to mirror the object of my desires while also allowing them space for theirs. This picture is from my last residency at Fire Island. And I've been thinking a lot about the deers there and specifically the relationship to the land, and thinking of deers as an emblem for desire. My friend at a bathhouse in Northampton, a self-portrait in Tokyo, my ex-roommate smoking a cigarette in our kitchen. I asked my friends to wrestle. I got this. And I think it was maybe 20 in this picture. Which brings me to my last body of work, entitled I'm So Glad You're Here, which I have been working at for a really long time. And this image is actually the anchor for this work. I like to think about the implications of withholding oneself to create tension between the subject and the viewer, born from a sort of anticipation of the figure's reciprocation that never comes. Permission must be asked to look while also to understand. To see a figure's face is not to know them. And so I wanted to step into that voyeurism and kind of be a welcome intruder to these scenes. I was also thinking about domestic space and its relationship to the queer body. So here's a picture of my friend in our apartment in Brooklyn that has been kind of shared and bounced around with our friend group. And I was photographing my friends, people I loved, people I cared about. Don't know how that got there. That was weird, sorry. Okay, that's funny. So it's very freaky. Anyway, I like to reimagine what a still life can look like. Is it still a still life if there's a person in it? Oh, sorry. I like to think about queer gestures, a piercing gaze, my millennial brand parade panties hanging in the shower. And again, thinking about this sort of refusal of not being able to see a person's face, but being able to know about them. And so that brought me here. And so I'm working through both archives and I'm making my own kind of formal portraits on how I understand and how I can translate queerness. I became really interested in metal sheets as a substrate for assemblage and how I could bring all of these different ways of seeing together. The reflective material serves as an introspection and observation. I want people to kind of have a visceral reaction to tangible material. Being able to create like these on-site figurations really felt like the answer to the presentation. Archives, or the archives that I'm working with, really work as a way to understand traces of the past that I choose to carry to the present, leaving, I think, some space for the things that are unrecorded. I'm interested in time as a construct and how it can both be linear and fragmented, something that can be stretched so far that you cannot tell what's beginning and what's end, for a collection of images to be paired together in a temporal space, using a central Black femme figure as the anchor of the work. A head turned away, I think indicates a erotic chance glance or a way of queer self-monitoring to be subverted. Yeah, I wanted to give the work pause. I wanted to question what it means to make a queer image through different ways of seeing, by focusing on the mundane and thinking about the decisive moment, but also embracing, you know, a voyeuristic authorship. So that's it. Thank you. Questions? Mm-hmm.
Did you pull the photograph from the hive at a specific time, or was that like organic where they ate and how
Yeah. So basically, what we intend, my beekeeper ended up, what we had to do is that they were it was kind of cold, and so we couldn't keep the boxes open for too long. And so basically, every day I would come at whatever time, and I would record the process of it. And then when it got to a point that I was like, okay, this is good, I would take it out. But it depends on the aggression of the hive. So the more aggressive hive was a little bit more lazy, which I thought was funny, or like the racks in the hive. Like if there's more on one side, one will be worked on a little bit more than the other one. And I think if I left it like just the newsprint, didn't take it out, probably would have been like a week and a half. It would have been completely gone. But pretty much every day I was kind of checking in on like where it was and yeah, how much they were doing.
How did you feel like when you're watching them eat away? Like your yeah.
Yeah. So what's interesting is that initially I wanted to use some kind of sugar paper so they could actually eat it, but they wouldn't. The beekeeper was like, they won't actually eat it. They're kind of just like they're tearing it away, right? So they're not necessarily consuming it. They're kind of just cleaning, which I think kind of changed the relationship to making the work. But I think they were just kind of doing their job, and I think they were doing what I was asking them to. Yeah, and thinking about that ask for domestic labor to make this work felt important.
Any other questions?
At the end, you about the three large portraits in your installation and the importance of the subject being turned away, and you said that subversion of queer self-monitoring.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Can you elaborate?
Yeah. There's this kind of idea that it's safe to look with someone with a queer gaze in the back of their head, and it's safer that way because they can't meet your gaze. And so I was thinking a lot about that, but also thinking about it as a bit of a refusal of acknowledgement almost. Yeah, and I think the like self, or at least the text that I was reading or the things that I was thinking about, the like self-monitoring that comes in when going into spaces and not knowing where queerness is safe and how you can move freely in the world, and how it's safer to look at the back of somebody's head literally than to meet their queer gaze and have that kind of chance of are they or aren't they.
I love what you said. The tension of the anticipation that will come.
Yeah.
This could be for either of you. When you're working with the subject, taking pictures of people, how often are you sort of calling on visions that you've had of how like a portrait might look in your mind and bringing that forward into the work versus just in the moment, like instinctually making the image and sort of following the lead of the subject?
Okay. I really like the microphone, so I'm going to talk to you here. I mean, so for the first series that I showed, I was sketching everything before I made it. I still have all my journals. I would kind of, because it was me and my partner making the work, I had access to them all the time, and I would just sketch and then be like, all right, let's go. We're making these images today. But I think in grad school, I found that it was harder to plan in advance. I was making all of my work in New York, so like traveling from Connecticut to the city, and kind of just hoping that I could make something happen. Like I remember there's one instance where I had met someone that I wanted to photograph, and I pulled up to their house with like my camera, my lights, like all of my gear, and they texted me like, by the way, all of my friends are here right now. And so I had to kind of just like figure out what we would do, where we would shoot. And yeah, I think it's been a really wonderful challenge because I find that like a lot of beautiful accidents happen. Like the poster in the back of Ellington, I didn't know that was going to be there. I just showed up with my gear and And that's what happened. He didn't even want to shoot in that room necessarily. So yeah, it's a combination of the two. It really depends. But I think like part of trying to be present and to like think about this current moment, it felt important for me to just kind of let things flow and happen and like allow chance to play a role in making it work.
I think for me, some of the, well, most of the photographs, and I'm so glad you're here, are recreations of things that I'm experiencing in real time. And so the first image of that, sorry, I'm going to out you. It's a picture of Avi's head. And that came to be because the night or two before that, I saw my friend talking to my other friend at the bar doing that exact same gesture. And something about that was so compelling. So a lot of the time I'm kind of just living my life and looking at things and taking like photographs on my phone and then coming back to them to recreate them, which has not always been the way, always been my mode of working, but it's been working out pretty well. So, yeah.
Having included romantic partners in your work, how do you experience the meaning of the work changing as you move in and out of relationships? Or how do you think about
Why?
Like, you want to take this?
I'm wondering about like access?
Yeah. I think for me, the kind of big push to kind of go with like obscuring people's heads was because I wanted to protect them, but also I was thinking about the way in which those relationships change. And it's something that's been brought up before, you know, where it's like, if this person that I used to be involved with no longer wants me to use maybe a snapshot that I've had with them in 5 years, and that's like completely okay with me. Because I think for me, it's more important for people to be seen and felt and heard rather than to be exploited. I feel that way because the nature of our relationship has changed. But I think so far it's been fine. We'll see. But I think it's really important for me to be careful of people's images. Like I think that's the biggest thing for my understanding of this work. Yeah, is to make sure that people feel good and yeah.
I'm going to be really honest with you. That first series, Shadows, I made with my partner for maybe 3 years. And when we broke up, I didn't touch my camera for a while, to be honest. Yeah, it felt like it was a story that I was telling, a world that I was creating, but also a reflection of our relationship. So that was really hard, but I think in that I learned, or I thought a lot about representation and the different ways that I could think about photographing people in my community, people that I love, and ways of looking at people that aren't so like direct. So I make a lot of silhouette portraits of people. It's not really clear what their face looks like or anything beyond their silhouette and the way that they hold their shoulders or the way that they hold their head. And I feel like, to me, that's a really important conversation about like representation, the significance of visibility, the harm of it. And yeah, I think I'm like constantly working through it. But in terms of relationships, I think now I just kind of live with the images and like they're their own thing and they're not necessarily about me and the people in them always. Yeah. But yeah, that sucked.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Follow up on that. Was that collaboration always intended to kind of be removed from your actual relationship? Like, was it creating a sort of, fictional relationship? Or did it start as just documenting a relationship? Or was
Yeah, I mean,
set in a different time period.
no, it was meant to be the story. We were playing a role. So we were dressing up in like clothing from the 40s that I was collecting. And we shot in Louisiana. I think I didn't really explain that. There are two women, supposedly they were in love in the 30s and the 40s. And yeah, I was just like creating a period piece with them and playing the roles with my partner. And I mean, I think like ultimately what ended up happening is like all of the little things that happened in their life together. For example, them cutting off all their hair and kind of like changing the way that they looked. That became a part of the story. So everything was kind of interwoven without me necessarily meaning to. So I guess both things are happening at the same time. And it feels like a marker, like a memory of our time together in addition to these fictional people. So yeah. Thank you.
It was a nice fit. We know each other pre-residency, but it was by chance that we were.
We went to jail. I mean, Yale.
It's recorded.
They know.
It's been really interesting to see both the way you create archives and work from them, but very different in different ways.
Yeah.
To produce very different work. It's been really interesting.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions?